So the books that we're talking about tonight are called decodable books. So decode essentially means to sound out. And that's what we want to reinforce for kids. We want them to get enough practice in saying the sounds, saying the word, pushing the sounds together until they don't have to, actually sound it out anymore. They could just look at the word, and it gives the appearance as if they're just, getting it. But this has come after many exposures of putting these sounds together.
I think it's important to highlight that it's not because they've memorized what the word looks like. It's because they actually know that those letters represent that word. And it's not that they've memorized it because they can tell in different fonts, right? Mm-hmm. Or if it's written in capitals or lowercase, it's not that they've memorized the image or the picture.
Right. So you mentioned something very important. So in other words, and I think David Kilpatrick pointed that out with the different fonts. That's probably where you saw that, because I saw him do that too, where you could have the same word and you could put it with some capitals, lowercase letters. You could put it into big print, all caps. It doesn't matter. If a child understands letter sound connections, they could work their way to the word. So anyhow, it shouldn't matter about what the font is. Now, if a child is memorizing the word as a picture, they won't recognize the word if the font changes, right? So if they know stop, even, as, STOP in capital letters, and then all of a sudden they see it, mixed up, lowercase, capital, all lowercase, they might not know because they're not using their correspondences to read the word. They're looking at it as a whole. So can you memorize words as pictures? Yes, you can. You can look at it and look at it as a picture, but you're not going to get very far in reading other words. You can only memorize a certain number of words as a picture after repeated exposures of seeing it, like some symbol, like the McDonald's arches. You can do that, but that's not how we read. We don't learn to read that way. There's a difference. And that's the misunderstanding that I think really has been a problem in schools for years now. We know it.
Definitely. And I think it's really important that this becomes common knowledge. And even when you're talking about sight words is something that people, used to use more commonly for like red letter words or irregularly spelt words that you can't sound out and decode every letter and get it so it's saying what you think it does. And that is not the same as a word that's in your sight vocabulary. So we're not stuck sounding them out, but you also put words that are phonetic into your sight vocabulary and you have that instantaneous recognition.
Yeah, so that's something that also is misunderstood, where you could see a list of words, and many of those sight words are actually completely decodable. I mean, the word and, there's nothing tricky about the word and. You know all the sounds, you could get through the word. And yet, it's something that we say as a sight word. Then you have other words where maybe a small part of it is not regular at the moment because that child did not get up to that part of the code. It's a little bit more advanced and it's coming in earlier in their learning, so they're learning it as a sight word. But if we really try to teach all words through letter sound correspondences, and then we could kind of tease out what is difficult about certain words and, focus on what's irregular at the moment until perhaps they learn at another point in time, oh yeah, that does make sense to me now. So where, let's say they didn't learn EA yet, just throwing that out there. And it could be embedded in a word that's there at the moment that they're expected to know, doesn't mean that you can't figure it out. So it's easy enough to just say, well, in that word, those letters are showing the sound for E or for E or whatever it is. And so now let's work our way through it. And then later on, when you really teach that at a sensible time, as you build up skills, then you could see other words that have that pattern. But that's not really how it's done. Generally, kids are given lists of words even before they understand any letter sound correspondence. And they're expected to just know the words from the list. And this is basically what shows up in those leveled books. Lots of words that are high frequency words, right, that you see often. And then it's used again and again in these books. And then kids are getting mixed messages because they don't know when to sound out words and then when to use their memory of sight words. So if you're telling a child, oh, well, these are our sight words and these are words we sound out, they're going to end up trying to just memorize everything. And that's what they do. They will use whatever means possible to figure out that word, whether it's through pictures, whether it's through the predictable pattern. They're going to use that as their default strategy, especially if they have, if they're having trouble decoding, they're going to resort to something like that. Other kids, where they're more typical learners, they might be able to figure out the code without this real explicit instruction, but many kids won't.
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention that the way that you teach reading is going to have an impact on the way that these kids are approaching reading. So if you start with a very good foundation in phonics and teach that decodable strategy, then we can move through these decodable texts quite quickly, right?
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned before how they're not for everybody. I'm going to...
What I meant was, like, once everybody can start with them.
Okay, good. I'm glad you said that.
No, I mean that everybody can start with them, but once you have kids that are reading and are no longer needing to decode, they don't need them.
Yes.
Right?
Okay, good.
You can move on from them. I'm not saying, and you have those kids that show up to school, with great phonological awareness, great decoding already. They have the strategies needed. So you may use them just to make sure that they're at the benchmark and they know how to use it, but don't stick them to stay at those decodable books because they're past that skill. And we don't want to, kill the joy of reading, which I think is a big thing that people from, the balanced literacy and the whole language approach take from it. Oh, if we're sticking them in decodable books all the time, they're going to hate reading because it's not fun. But if they can read it and they can read it fluently and everything, then they shouldn't be reading it anymore. They should be moving on to the next one, right?
Right. Now, I actually put up a couple of posts today that we were talking about. And I do think that you could use that for one of your Mythbusters.
Yeah.
So that the myth is that decodable text is boring. And I think that if you really look at high quality decodable books, you will see that many of them are written beautifully. And the kids don't find them boring at all because there's nothing boring about being able to read the words on the page. For a young child, That is thrilling.
Mhm.
So, you know, we have to step out of our adult bodies and really try to get into a child's mind. And for a child who's just starting to feel successful and seeing, oh, yes, I could really, truly get through the words on the page, and I understand how to do this, that is very exciting for them. And, you know, I think if you look at it next to a book that uses the repetitive language, like I can do blank at the library. I think that's what I posted. I don't even remember. It was something like that. I can do blank at the library. I can do blank at the library. I can do blank at the library. I don't think that's so thrilling. To be honest, you know, I don't think you could look at that. I'm not saying it's not a joyful read if you're sharing a book out loud. If you read a book out loud and maybe the child is about to go on a trip to the library, never, you know, stepped foot in a library, and you start trying to expose the child to expectations, what they're going to see in the library, well, then that's a fine book to read out loud and talk about the library experience. But to think that a young child who doesn't know how to put letters and sounds together could truly read library if you took the pictures away and you took the repetition of the phrase away, no, they would not be able to read library. They're forced to have to use the pictures. They're forced to have to use other types of cues to get through that. And that might work in these earlier books pretty easily for a kid who has pretty strong language skills and kind of could navigate the book pretty well. They could fool you. Well, oh, yes, I'm reading a book. And they keep turning pages and they keep looking around. And then all of a sudden, it gets a little harder and a little harder. And the pictures start to go away. And the sentences are not in that repetitive, predictable way anymore. They're written as true sentences, authentic sentences. All of a sudden, by the time they get to about, you know, a K or an L, I've had kids who just stay there. You know, even if they could get through the lower books, many of them can't, but even if they could get through some of those lower books, the real test comes about KLM for those older kids. They don't move because then it's really, there's nothing about those books that could get you past that point if they don't know the code, if they don't know how to get through multi-syllable words, if they don't understand how words work. It just, they just get frozen at a certain point. And they just start guessing all over the place. Their eyes are jumping everywhere. And it's not a tracking problem. People think this is a visual tracking problem.
And that's where we get the visual training, but it's because they're being trained to look elsewhere for clues, right?
Correct. And I won't say all the time. There are certain kids, and I always want to clear that up because, you know, there are people watching who will say, well, wait a minute, my child really does have a vision problem. Yes, there are vision problems. But that is not what we're talking about when we're talking about a kid who really, you know, could have dyslexia, has trouble understanding how to read. We are almost encouraging them to jump all over the page instead of left to right all through the word, which is what they should be doing if they're taught correctly with the right tools.
Yeah, well, and one of the things that I wanted to bring up was this quote from the Reading Ape. And he's talking about how the use of controlled text, excuse me, the use of controlled text removes the reason or excuse for guessing, and guessing can be unstitched by references to teach and to learn the code knowledge. So what we're really focusing on tonight is talking about teaching these children phonics and giving them the books that they have the skills to read. And from your book, you said the books children are given to practice should be match what they are learning. Decodable books are only decodable if children are first taught the code and taught and understand the code.
Right. So there's nothing decodable. It's not like the books are magically going to do this. Now, there are some books that are designed very well, like I See Sam, where they're meant as a teaching tool and they're decodable. And basically, it follows where if you're just using those letters and sounds and it's cumulative, they're getting practice. The design of it really ensures that they're going to not only get practice, but it's being used as a tool to teach with. But what I'm saying is, you can't just take a decodable book off a shelf and say, okay, now this child will be able to decode it. So if there are words in it that have, let's say, OU as ooh, like in soup, and they have no idea, and like group, and they only knew OU as ow, well, then that's not decodable for them at that point unless they're taught to flex the vowel, that OU represents ow, maybe most of the time, but it can also show the ooh sound. So it's only decodable if we're showing kids the code and how to use it properly. And that quote that you just mentioned, yeah, that control in the text for a new reader is just so important to their learning. It's not an extra. It's not something that should just be like, okay, if they have it, fine. If they don't, that's okay too. Because what's happening, what I'm seeing, and I think you and I were having this conversation before, even when teachers embrace phonics, and they're seeing the science of reading, and you see that, oh, there are teachers coming around saying, yes, phonics is important. One of the hardest things for teachers to change is this thought that they have to be in these types of leveled books. They'll do the phonics, but they don't want to give the decodable books a chance to really reinforce what they're learning in phonics. I find that is one of the hardest things to change. I could tell you where I live on Long Island, most school districts, even if they have some kind of phonics program, and they vary in terms of effectiveness and how serious they are about teaching the phonics, from it could be a 5 to 10 minute sound drill of A apple, a, e, ed, to actually doing some more work. But then after they might do a beautiful phonics lesson, they're being put into leveled books where they don't even use those skills. And this misunderstanding really hurts kids, especially ones with dyslexia. Because like I said, a typical reader might be able to transfer some of their understanding to something that's not controlled. But kids with any type of decoding problem, they need that practice to see it again and again, like you said, in order to make those words into sight words, all words, not just high frequency words.
Exactly. And it's important that we do that, especially because, as you were mentioning earlier, as they get to that KLM level and the level text, that's when it's also, they can't they can't use the predictable nature. And that's when we're seeing the kids in grade 3 and grade 4 hit that brick wall, right? Because they can't use those strategies in the bookmarks that they send home, because the pictures aren't telling them anything, and it's not a repeating pattern, and they're being introduced so many new vocabulary words by this point. Like by the time they reach grade 4, they're getting about 1,000 new vocabulary words
Yes.
from reading.
Yes.
And
Yeah. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
if you haven't heard the word before, you're not going to be able to guess it.
Correct.
Context or anything.
That's right. So, yeah, we call that, this term has been around forever. I didn't coin it, but it's called the fourth grade slump.
Yeah.
And so, definitely by fourth grade, when that transition from learning to read to
Mhm.
reading to learn really happens, and it starts to happen, like you said, in third grade for sure.
Mhm.
But by fourth grade, when they already are expected to read text that's text outside their world, right? Their home, their friends, where they're really reading to learn at this point. And they're given multisyllable words, and they're given lots of prefixes and suffixes, and they don't know how to get through those bigger words. It all falls apart. And so you will have 4-syllable words turn into 2-syllable words. Happens all the time, where they see the beginning, they see the end, they leave out the middle, they change the middle, they mix up the syllables. And then people think that, oh yeah, they're just seeing things backwards. But you certainly know it has nothing to do with seeing things backwards. It's holding on to a sequence of chunks in a bigger word and being able to remember that and hold on to it to come up with the word. So
Yeah.
it all falls apart by then. So if this does not happen early enough, K-2, starting to build in the preschool years, a good sound letter foundation, going into those K-2 years where they're really focused on building letter sound connections and practicing, that's when you get kids older in decodable books, right? Ideally, you would want to keep them only in decodables in those early grades until they're ready to move out. But that's why there is a need for these types of books for older kids, because we have so many older kids who did not get it in the earlier grades.
Of course. And I think this is a perfect time to talk about how when we have these students in older grades, it's really important to supplement the decodable books with audiobooks.